Because the market wants to see us, it doesn't want any of these programs to stop. It wants money in minorities' pockets. It wants to differentiate the market. It wants to know what you would buy that I wouldn't, and vice versa, so that it better accommodates and props up our quality of life.
That's James Felton Keith, affectionately known as JFK. He's an award-winning mechanical engineer and labor economist. He's also the CEO of InclusionScore Companies and the lecturer at the University of Georgia. In 2017, he was the first Black LGBT person to run for federal office in the United States with his bid for Harlem's Congressional seat. As an entrepreneur, he established the first international diversity and inclusion certification. I'm Marilyn Germain, the host and producer of the Dear Human Resources podcast. In this episode, James is going to talk about the recent cuts of DEI programs around the country and the laws surrounding DEI programs. Welcome, James.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
So back in 2024, 3 states, Alabama, Iowa, and Utah, banned diversity, equity, and inclusion offices at public universities, continuing a trend, if you will, that kicked off in 2023 with Florida and Texas. And so after that, Donald Trump's return to the White House in November 2024, more than a dozen companies pared back, some of them even removed altogether references to diversity, equity, and inclusion in their 2024 annual reports to investors, including Pepsi, GM, Google, Disney, GE, Intel, PayPal, Chipotle, Comcast, and I could cite a few more. You know, in 2025, other companies are continuing to roll back DEI programs. So how do we define diversity, equity, and inclusion? What are its core objectives?
Thanks for the question. And yeah, we are in tragic times, I would say, where both federal, state, and municipal governments are challenging the tenets of identifying the diversity in our communities, advocating for, equitable distribution of value, and making people feel included and belong and a sense of belonging. But with regards to how we define it, I will say as I define it, as someone as a representative of the international ISO 30415 standard, I define it as specifically that as a business process specific to the ISO 30415 standard. Now, that may mean a lot more elaborate things. I try not to use the regular poetry of DEI and B because I think it is sometimes confusing to people. But if we move from an international context of that number-riddled standard down to the American context, we're defining it as leveraging of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and our efforts to not deliberately discriminate against anyone or retaliate, against anyone for being a member of a protected class. And it applies across the board. It's sort of a part of our inalienable, search for equal rights, something I think originally initiated by the 14th Amendment of the United States. I think when we piece the 14th Amendment together with the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and think about this in the context of employment, whether we're at a university, a government, or for-profit company, the way we should define it is as building adequate feedback mechanisms to understand, number one, who our employees and consumers are, and number two, how to deliberately include them, engage them, et cetera. I think that's how DEI professionals who actively consult in the standard and organize organizations, not necessarily the communications people. I think that's also how lawyers look at DEI. I get that the word has become a bit contentious, for all better purposes. I guess when I go around and some of the hate mail and DMs I'm receiving online right now, they use DEI like the new N-word, but specific to the states that have tried to delete DEI and the federal government's efforts, they're both contradictory and not, I would say, achievable, with the exception of deleting a couple of federal and state-funded jobs. Even those at state and federal funded universities. And as tragic as it is, I think the economy, and we're starting to see this right now, will eventually reject it both legally and from an economic and capital standpoint, reject it being the deletion of DEI or DEI programs, simply because there are not enough men to operate the economy in the world as we know it.
That's a great segue to my next question, which is, can you shed light on what's happening with DEI initiatives in the US right now? And why are so many large organizations slashing their DEI programs?
I think to answer your second question first, I think the reason that they're slashing, at least from a communication standpoint, is to avoid legal risk. And specifically, I mean, avoid lawsuits that might cost $1 more than they would like to spend on existing operations, right? So some of it is dog and pony. When I look at the for-profit companies that have deleted DEI or communicated at least that they're slashing DEI initiatives, we don't really see a push or a pullback from engaging employees in trying to give them a sense of belonging and opportunity inside those organizations, as much as we see some of the public markers being moved away from. So we see companies, for instance, moving away from the human rights campaigns indexes. We see them deleting more public-facing events that are specific to a particular protected class, whether it be specific to gender or race or ethnicity or age or disability or you name it. Most things usually fall in the race and ethnicity place. But by and large, we count about, as of this week, 20 firms that are soaking up all the headlines with regards to moving back. But we don't really see more than 6% of the market. And to put that in perspective for everyone, there are about 5.2 million companies that pay an adequate amount of taxes in this country. There are more companies, but they're usually small consulting companies that people have started on their, laptops at Starbucks.
Yeah.
But so as a handful of companies, they are big companies, but when we really look at what they're doing differently, they haven't moved away from how they want to engage both employees and consumers. And the main reason behind that is if any company, I don't care whether you're a government, those are companies, whether you're a university, those are companies, and whether you are a for-profit, obviously those are companies. If you move back from adequately engaging, identifying protected class in a select way, like say Black people, but not women, it is an easy roadmap to litigation around retaliation. Stating that you, for instance, do not see a particular type of individual or class of individuals inside your organization when there is adequate evidence that you have in the past, when the data is evident, there are a sea of lawyers waiting for those opportunities to basically push litigation on your company. And if anyone's not familiar, I would just reference orgs like the National Employment Lawyers Association, the NELA. They're starting to market and solicit employment law practices in the same way we used to see personal injury back in the 90s. I saw a billboard here in New York that said, never leave your employer without a lawyer, because there are real liability to just turning away from people that have been used to being seen in your organization, going back to whatever belonging might mean to people. So we've seen pushback. We've seen communications around people moving back because the president is threatening using the Department of Justice to also litigate. But what I'm seeing in the market as an insurance professional, my company, InclusionScore, is an insurance company at the end of the day, and we use the international standard for DEI to rate professional liability insurance. What we see is a heightening in the price of doing business because people are suing both for regular discrimination and retaliation and whatever people might call reverse discrimination or retaliation. I really can't stand those words. They remind me of irregardless, which is not a word. It just means regardless. It's redundant. You can be, or you can discriminate, against cis, white, straight men. So the method with which an institution both identifies people, creates feedback mechanisms, and then engages those people matter most at this point in time. And because we have more people insisting that they've been retaliated and or discriminated against, it's just going to be more expensive to do business in the United States and really outside for any companies that are multinational and carry a heavy hand from an employment standpoint outside of our American borders. So that's how I see the market right now. I'm looking at it from an insurance standpoint.
So, do you think there are any DEI practices that have been ruled illegal or controversial by courts?
I think any practice that is not first validated, right? So I think that's a great question because what we essentially deliver via the standard, again, when I define DEI, I would define it as, to be wonky, ISO 30415. And what the ISO standard, as we call it, delivers for organizations is basically a portfolioization of all services that an org might deploy onto itself from a DEI standpoint. In the same vein that a chief information officer might deploy hardware and software onto the organization for its customers, the people in the organization to use, right? If you want to write letters, your CIO might buy Microsoft Word for you to do that. If you want to understand the demographics of your organization, your chief diversity officer, your CHRO, or you name it, may leverage an app to better understand who's in your organization. So when we use the standard to first portfolioize all those services, there may be so many other services like in supplier diversity, in other organizational stakeholders, and how you engage trade associations and how you lead trainings, whether they be specific to, like we're in Black History Month right now, next month will be Women's History Month, a variety of these offerings, companies should look at them as services. When we first categorize those, then establish a feedback mechanism. Though a real world tangible example of a feedback mechanism would be something like an employee resource group or business resource group or an affinity group. If a company can identify a community via those feedback mechanisms and validate work that it may do in educating either those people or other people in the organization about those people, it is protected. To answer your question, when we see organizations miss the mark and potentially run up against discrimination is when they deploy ad hoc programs around DEI without validating how and or why they've done this. And so that's where we start to run to the Title VII interpretation of who has been included and who has not been included. Because there's a new class of primarily white men and a few other people here and there who are claiming to be reverse retaliated and or discriminated against, we have to be more rigorous in how we deploy the work that we do with regards to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And so there are plenty of scenarios. I can think of one stands out where Starbucks in Colorado had some deliberate hiring efforts. They were not hiring quotas, but they wanted to engage Asian women. If they would have documented why they were engaging those women, which is they live in the community and they see them in Denver and elsewhere, they would have been able to protect themselves against a claim of reverse discrimination. But instead, they ended up paying out $25 million to a white man who said they was discriminating against him in order to hire Asian women in his area. Now, that $25 million insurance claim and legal settlement could have been a $25,000 legal fee to their lawyer, only because lawyers are expensive, to kind of throw out the case. But at the point where you cannot prove why you are deliberately engaging in equitable and inclusive practices, which is how I like to define DEI's deliberate equity and inclusion. When you can't explain why, under pressure in an argument in a court of law, you could potentially be liable. And so what I see in the market outside of those few dozen companies that are not engaging in these practices is people kind of in a holding pattern to prepare to deploy something a bit more rigorous to both protect themselves from litigation by the federal government and or the few states that you mentioned, but also continue to engage employees because, again, per the real market incentive for deliberate equity and inclusion, there just aren't enough men to do the work. And in this country in particular, there aren't enough straight white men to do the work in the economy. So that's sort of where I see things are. But yes, certain companies, per their practices, can be liable for retaliation or discrimination. There's certainly an argument to be made there. But I think what Trump and company are doing is really providing an opportunity to professionalize and standardize the DEI market, to actually turn DEI into a profession away from what it was, which was, essentially a series of, ad hoc programs and marketing strategies to let people know that we see them. And a lot of good has come of it. But now I think we're at this time where more rigor will be applied to both shore up companies' ability to access top talent with merit as a result of DEI, but also protect itself or protect themselves from litigation.
How do you think companies should structure their DEI programs to ensure compliance with employment law? And then I have a follow-up question about merits, since you mentioned merits.
I think if they use the standard, like most of the chief diversity officers or equity inclusion officers, or, they all have different titles that we've met over the years. If they weren't a part of the 2,000 or so people between, America and Geneva and the 163 countries that ratify the standard, they usually are unaware of it. So every company is kind of recreating the wheel each time it wants to deliver DEI. That's a problem. I met a chief diversity officer recently. She took over HR for a mid-sized company in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And she said, I was a librarian before this. And so tell us what to do. We'll implement that and we'll go from there. So I think the issue is right now, there's not enough communication about the broad consensus around what DEI is that has been adopted since 2021, which is when the international standard was published. I would advise companies to follow the process of the standard. It is a workflow management process, just like how an institution might deliver cybersecurity rigor or quality rigor. It's all based on ISO 9001. It's very engineering and compliancy. But what I can say is that your insurance carrier, which underwrites all professional liability, will respect your process and view it as foolproof from frivolous litigation, which I do consider the lot of the litigation from the Justice Department to be frivolous.
So let's talk about merit.
Yeah.
There's a push towards emphasizing merit before diversity per se. How can businesses balance diversity efforts with merit-based hiring and promotions as well?
There's no balance, because if merit can exist at all, it is a byproduct of DEI. Like if I meet someone, they say I'm the greatest DEI professional of all time, which I have come across those people. I'm like, well, how many clients do you have? In which countries do you operate? Because I work with 500 across 32 countries, and we're well-versed in the standard. And so my normal question to folks is, who the hell are you? If you cannot identify the rigors with which you are evaluating your merit-verse mind, because you have included me in your evaluation of yourself, then you are not the best. I mean, you may have, some merit in what you do. So I would say if folks do want to harp on that word, which has always been a bit of a cop-out in my opinion, that's fine. They can use that word, but merit would always be a proxy of DEI. I would also, again, lean on the standard and other standards to better define who we'd like to promote into what positions. I think as we move into this era where more technology is working alongside of us, whether it's AI or what have you, and we're trying to get the best work product out of people of all sorts, I think we're finding that even old programs like leveraging seniority to consider who makes the best manager might need to go out the window. We might want to consider who has the best EQ or the best soft skills to manage people versus people who may be great at being subject matter experts, et cetera. And so, again, when talking about merit, I think we cannot consider it without DEI as a leading guide. Only at the point that you've considered the diverse participants in your talent pool, the kind of equitable access to opportunity they've had, and points at which they've been included, can you start to consider whatever merit might be? I think two separate things are happening right here. We're fighting a marketing campaign that is against all sorts of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they are replacing it with merit. And then there's the operations of business, which is already hard enough on its own, that now we have to compete with everyone trying to reconsider whatever DEI might be and whatever merit might be.
We mentioned earlier that some organizations have slapped their DEI programs, but many more have not. They are keeping their DEI programs as they were prior to Trump's being in the White House. Are there any legal risks for organizations that continue race-conscious DEI programs despite the legal challenges?
I think only from a bullying and retaliation standpoint. I do believe I anticipate, I should say, Trump's Justice Department trying to make an example out of some companies. And I think that those companies, if they are big enough, have already made the choice. This is going to be a cost of doing business. We're going to fight it. And similar to the judges that we just saw throw out Trump's executive orders, or put a halt, rather, to Trump's executive orders deleting DEI programs, I think we'll see case law prevail, and the majority of the judges that are in our federal and state systems start to reference the unconstitutionality of some of these efforts, whether it's unconstitutional at the federal level or the state level. And to give you more color, I would just reference the new state constitution here in New York. I'm in New York today. And on the same ballot that Trump was elected this past year, on the back of that ballot in New York, there was a proposition, it was called Prop 1, which amended and enshrined identity types, or DEI, into our state constitution. So if you're in New York State, which is the second largest state for corporations that I would say matter, the whole banking world is ushered through this state. We distribute audits from banking to insurance to you name it, from the Department of Financial Services here. They're all obligated to abide by our state constitution. And it would break the federation for the federal government to deny a state its states' rights. I'm using air quotes right now. You can't see me, but so all of that in play, to answer your question, yes, there may be some legal risk, but it is weatherable. And the other thing I'll say about really big companies that matter in this space, like banks and insurance companies, like I'll do a talk at the largest insurance brokerage on the planet tonight about this issue, because we're going to talk about the rise in prices of professional liability because of these lawsuits. And I haven't seen any of those companies get rid of their DEI staff. It's mainly for two reasons. They know that there aren't enough men to do the work in the economy or in our industry, and so they need people to work there. But number two, they know that they need these programs to keep both talent engaged and plan for whatever the workplace will work like tomorrow. And so I maybe add one more thing to those first two. They also know that there's no real legal grounds for deleting the deliberate engagement, equity, and inclusion that companies engage in. There's just no legal grounds. One more thing I want to say about the first executive order that Trump pushed out. If everyone reads those executive orders, he actually affirmed the language of Title VII. He didn't say, like, we're getting rid of this or getting rid of the Civil Rights Act, right? What he was really doing was trying to identify a new protected class and suggest that straight white men are also being discriminated against, which is like saying reverse discrimination. It wasn't necessary. You can discriminate against cis straight white dudes. Kanye West just did it in a terrible fashion. And both the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 via Title VII, it protects everybody, no matter what you look like, no matter what your gender is, no matter what your race is, et cetera. And so Trump's leveraging of these executive orders, what it's really done is create a media frenzy around the idea that he's getting rid of deliberate equity and inclusion when he really hasn't changed anything at all. and it will be argued in court and is being argued in court right now. I think a coalition of chief diversity officers at universities just got a legal win. I believe it was Friday or yesterday. It's Tuesday. I can't remember exactly which day, but they got a halt to some of these orders to delete these programs because of how they're unconstitutional, how they're rolling them out, and because they're contradictory to our regular efforts of creating equality. Equality is a pretty elusive term. If you ask me, I'm more of an equity advocate than an equality advocate. But because of how constitutional amendments are written, it is difficult to say we're going to stop doing inclusivity for one group and start doing it for a new group. And even when we think about the university landscape and some of your colleagues, even if universities start taking away, and this will become more legal risk for them, programs for minorities of other sorts to gather, I already know there's a bucket of money there. There are different action-based groups, not included with the ACLU, that are just focused on suing universities for recognizing sororities, which is also a type of DEI. You can't get rid of one without getting rid of everything and waking up one day and you go, oh my God, there are only men of a certain sort in this country. We're not going to move 200 million people out of here.
James, are you saying we are overreacting and we should just chill?
I wouldn't say we're overreacting. After I got over my own nervous breakdown weeks ago, I think we are reacting, and it is proof that we are awake and that it will require us doing like this podcast, but also arguing in courts of law, et cetera, for our need to be seen. And I'll say this about, modern capitalism, or what I even like to call it inclusionism, is because the market wants to see us. It doesn't want any of these programs to stop. It wants money in minorities' pockets. It wants to differentiate the market. It wants to know what you will buy that I wouldn't, and vice versa, so that it better accommodates and props up our quality of life. And when Trump was putting out his executive orders, if we go back about 3 weeks ago, we were all in Davos at the World Economic Forum. And I didn't hear a single CEO say something along the lines of what Trump was saying. They all sounded like the negative reciprocal of what Trump was saying, because they all know that they need to see more of us to both run their businesses and design their next product or service. So I wouldn't say we're overreacting. I think if we think that the world is over, sure, we've overreacted, but we should just be prepared to try to understand the law, how business process works, and advocate for that, and protect, again, all of the infrastructure that we've built to include people based on that. That should be our continued reaction. But I wouldn't call it an overreaction. I think to be a little PO'd, not an overreaction at all. The fact that I'm losing my voice because, I've had this conversation on a podcast or 2-3 times today, that's not an overreaction. That's the work. I think that's what we should be doing.
So let's look ahead. How do you think DEI laws and policies will evolve, say, over the next 10 years?
If we're talking about policies internal to organizations, I think that they'll start to look more like cybersecurity and business process policies. It'll be like, if then do that. It'll be a bunch of if then statements. And we've spent 40 years mapping out everything that we could have possibly done wrong. It's just a matter of compiling and redeploying good processes, number one. And again, we've done this before. Even when we reference the international standard for DEI, the whole idea behind it was about 10 years ago, we came out with a standard for cyber, which is, I think when people hear cyber security, they think about technology, like it's a standard for tech, but it's really a people management standard. It's a standard for how people manage tech. And we can build processes in place to both educate people and build triggers that allow them to do and not to do certain things to make the workplace go on swimmingly. And as we liken it to people management or DEI or workforce resilience, as I've started to hear a lot of companies call it now, when we think about cyber, the biggest risk that we used to have to like our technologies, whether it be hardware or software or whatever, being vulnerable to ransomware. And as insurance companies tell other companies, you got to get more processes in play. Our biggest risk would be people, whether they were making intentional errors or not. And the worst kind of person you want managing your company's assets is somebody who hates working there. So people management, workforce resilience, and using standard business practices and processes to deploy people is a better risk management schema for everything under the umbrella that is valuable in our companies. Again, whether our companies are for-profits, universities, or governments. And so I think we'll start to see a more professionalized, standardized approach to DEI. It won't just be whoever is, a once retired Black or Asian woman working for our companies that is coming in, air quote, leading DEI because she represents a certain background. It'll be people who are maybe more versed in corporate ethnography and corporate change management and business processes than communications people. The other thing that I think we'll see change is right now at InclusionScore, we track about 47,000 D&I, we will call them practitioners. I think we reserve the word professional for people versed in the standard. And about 72% of those practitioners are people with communications or journalism backgrounds. Now, communications are certainly necessary for how we talk about DEI, but from an implementation standpoint, I think we need to pursue people or develop talent that is more versed in things like project management principles or Six Sigma business processes. I think will drive DEI going forward so that we can mitigate the risk of people coming to work in a more offensive way. But I do expect for these practices to scale and become more sustained over the next 10 years. And if that is not being led by the United States, it will just be led elsewhere. I think after Trump was elected, we got more calls and inquiries from Canada, India, South Africa, Peru, France than ever before because other countries and other companies see this as an opportunity to leapfrog us.
You're the CEO of InclusionScore Companies. I assume that's what you're referring to here. What is InclusionScore?
We're an insurance company. We're what you would call an insurtech. We deploy a service where we guide companies on how to create continual process improvement around DEI. So they're building certain infrastructure, they're portfolioizing all the services they might deploy. So what we would call a service would be, if you're training people to do something, they fit into 4 categories. Training is one category with DEI, and it can be a billion different things with regards to training. Data extraction, data collection is another category. Demographic analysis, sentiment analysis, that'd be an example. We help companies create internal infrastructure. That's a third type. Internal infrastructure would be something like an employee resource group, an affinity group, and also external infrastructure. It's like an example of external infrastructure would be like joining a chamber of commerce or a trade association, like the LGBT chamber, or if you're in the engineering space, the National Society for Black Engineers or whatever, if you're using them to extract talent or learn more about supplier diversity or how you engage orgs like the NMSDC, which is the National Minority Supplier Diversity Council. I'm using a lot of acronyms here, but all of that activity has been workflowed into this standard. So what we do at InclusionScore is we deliver companies software that will guide them through what to do first, second, and third. It looks like what we would call in tech a ticketing system. If anyone's not familiar, we look a lot like ServiceNow. They're a big publicly traded company, but instead of for IT service management, this is for D&I service management. So that's the primary service that we offer at InclusionScore. And we also wholly own an insurance brokerage. We offer the scores based on how companies interact with that standard to insurance carriers so that insurance carriers can reconsider companies' professional liability insurance premiums. So we just do those 2 things. We offer a risk management service and we offer insurance products to basically put a price on the lack of inclusivity.
Can you give us some data?
The way we track, for instance, I'll give you something else that we see in the landscape now that Trump is in office, is we do not anticipate and or trust the data coming out of the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, for anyone not familiar. They're the policing or watchdog for Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. But because we don't trust that data doesn't mean that we don't understand what's happening in the market. We look at insurance claims. We look at when someone says that you called them the forbidden word, or you pulled their hair. When companies settle in court or out of court with an aggrieved person around discrimination or reverse or whatever we're calling it, right? Insurance pays that bill. I don't know if a lot of people realize that. The insurance industry does not want to see more lawsuits coming from every which way, saying that you discriminate against me here, you discriminate against me there. So what they're doing is raising premiums and insisting that companies have better audits. And so the data that we look at, to your question, that gives us market indication of what's happening on, is we look at the entire size of what's called the employment practice liability insurance market. And we look at the growth rate. So the EPL market, as we call it for short, is about $7 billion annually in premiums. And it's rising at about 10 to 25% a year, depending on what type of company and what industry and what locale you're in. So we still see this being a market that is underpriced, where people are trying to figure out how to better exist in their work environments. And there's obviously a real resistance to it because, people don't like change. I mean, we've all learned it. I myself have been through a lot of changes and learned things in corporate world that I wasn't necessarily prepared for when we first started. But yeah, the way we look at DEI is as the cost of your insurance premiums plus the cost of ad hoc programs that may or may not be serving you well, plus at least one risk manager, which we will call an HR employee. So when we stack those three numbers up together, if you have a company with, let's say, we'll do some rough math for you, about 1,000 employees, we calculate that a company has probably spent about at least $300,000 a year in waste on poorly delivered DEI. Maybe a lot more if they have some real issues going on, which of course most companies do. So yeah, we follow the money, we follow the insurance premiums. And one way we incentivize firms to both comply and leverage the standard as a guide for how to deliver DEI in a more rigorous way is we tie to their insurance premiums. And we tell them, look, if you can get a decent score in certain areas here, you'll be eligible for a reduction in your premiums, plain and simple, compared to your competitors. If you want to be the best construction company or manufacturing company or hospital or hospitality company, or you name it, in your locale, in your industry, use the standard. If not, you can keep doing it the old way and we'll keep charging you more for it.
Fascinating, very interesting. I've never had a speaker talk about that. Definitely not the way you presented it. So I'm very thankful for your participation in our podcast show. And definitely was great having you on the show, James. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Support for this show comes from Western Carolina University, a campus of the University of North Carolina system, with the technical assistance of Kelly Minnis.